So I'm delighted to be joined by Jonathan Lakin from IntentHQ this morning for another episode of the UK AI podcast. And Jonathan, it's great to have you here. Welcome. And I wonder whether we could kick off by finding out a little bit more about you. Can you tell us how your journey led you to the creation of IntentHQ?
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be with you today, Tim. And so I'm someone who spent my life in data and AI, although my first degree was in typography of all things. So I have my claim to fame is Steve Jobs was the only other person I know who has a degree in typography.
Wow.
But that leads you into a different world. And I started coding PostScript when I was at university, and that led me on a journey into data and AI. And I think, when I think about my life's work, really, much of it has been, initially on a range of different data companies. I built some of the first relational OLAP systems in the Valley in the late 90s. And then in the last 10 years, it's been really trying to crack the code of customer intent and understand what people really do, the heart of the behaviors. And part of that came from this idea that we're not necessarily what we say, we are what we do. And people are creatures of habit. And if you think about things very simply, like, just the way you dry yourself coming out of a shower in the morning, you dry yourself exactly the same way day after day. And as those habits build, we start to create representations of ourselves. And part of that, the question is, how do you really create relevance? And part of that for me, in terms of the kind of desire, the kind of inner desire, was I noticed we started to live in a world that was noisier and noisier, where the amount of spam we have is just overwhelming. And the question was, how do you actually really cut through that? So how do you get to a point where you're doing away with trillions of irrelevant messages and just getting to the point where the things that matter actually get to you just automatically, magically, but without you being in a filter bubble? So part of that is the question of actually understanding what you want to do and helping you do what you want to do. So really that's the core of it. And there are many different dimensions to that, because you need to blend empathy into the process too. It's not just about behavior. It's how can you nudge the right things into place that make a difference for that person. And from the opposite side of the table, if you're a company, it's about really how do you turn engagement into revenue, right? So now on the other side of that, because you want to stop wasting money on sending people irrelevant things that they're never going to respond to, and actually just send them things that they really care about and will respond to. So that's the heart of it.
That's fascinating. So you started looking at the consumer behavior, and you look at the observed behavior almost, because that's a better representation of what the consumers are actually doing. So where are you using AI within your tool set? Is it something that you've been pioneering? Is it something that's coming soon?
No, I think we're one of the few companies that's been in the AI space for a long while now. So we realized, when I started the business, I realized that this was before it was even really fashionable to talk about AI, and people were talking about just machine learning or something different. It was even pre that, really. And it was like, our question was, how do you deeply understand a person from the data? And so we started to apply a whole lot of machine learning and different techniques. And in many ways, what people think about the AI today has narrowed into transformers and sequences and primarily of words, actually. But when we think about AI, we've really been thinking about AI based on behavior, these actions that people take. And so we started very early to actually work with language initially, and then actually realizing that language didn't get us the whole way there. So if you think about natural language and the basis of most LLMs today, they've become super good at understanding language and predicting as a consequence of that language. But we realized that behavior was something different. and that if you could understand behavior, the actions people take, and sequences, you would know much better about what they wanted and what was coming next and what paths they were on and so forth. And that was foundationally different. So we've built a suite of different AIs that do a whole range of things, that start all the way in the device. In handsets, we process data on the device, to very, very rich, sensitive sets of data. And part of that was kind of coming to the conclusion that data matters more than algorithms in many places. So the question was, how do you get hold of and process use data that people don't have access to? Often that's the most sensitive data, and therefore requires immense care and curation to make sure that you actually do have privacy by default built into that entire structure. And so part of our journey is learning how to do that, learning how to, you always have this trade-off between how much insight you can produce with no privacy is very high, add privacy, and you can get, have as much privacy as you want and get zero insight. And so the balance is, how do you get to the point where you get a lot of insight, but where you do have proper privacy in the mix? And that for us became a question of really trying to figure out, how do you get close to the source of data, of actions people take, people think about. The devices are one. The phones that we carry around, they have a lot of a huge amount of insight about what's happening to that device at any given time. And so then the question is, we adopted the Apple way, which is to keep the data on the device and figure out, how do you protect someone's privacy by ensuring that everything happens on that device. And then you need new techniques and new approaches to be able to figure out how to interact with that. So we've developed all of that, as well as a suite of different AIs. And those AIs, 6 or 7 different strands of AIs, if you like. When I think about those, you go all the way from being able to predict someone's interests and affinities, and we call that our audience AI, to predicting near-term intent. That's understanding patterns of intent. So if you think about Google keywords, where there is very close to intent, or you could think about actually someone's motivation. Think about a y-axis and someone's motivation, and you go all the way from long-term interests that someone has. I'm a rugby fan, as an example, to I have an intention to go to a game right now. And those two things are very different. And so you need to be able to understand the difference between like intent in the moment, in the real time. And those intents can be very short term, or they can be very long term. I could be moving house, and so understanding the pattern, the behaviors that I have to take me to the point that I move house. As I go through that journey, we get more and more sure that you are going to move house from the behaviors that are taking place. We might not know who you, Tim, are as a person or as a name, but the behaviors that you're carrying out absolutely help us to determine exactly where you are in the circle, in that cycle. Are you, have you done your research? Have you identified your area? Are you in the place where you're taking out a mortgage? Are you later on where you're dealing with the land registry, et cetera, et cetera? So understanding those are part of our intent AI.
Just to jump in there then, Jonathan, I mean, what you've been describing is sounds phenomenal, because you've gone from that initial sort of data science of bringing together all the data points about an individual and their intent on lots of different dimensions. And now you're talking about how you get this really rich multi-dimensional picture that allows you to really start to interpret that intent. And you're using, by the sounds of it, some AI tools, some sort of machine learning prediction models. I'd love to hear a little bit more about some of those models, or some of those tools that you're using. You started talking about, I think, the relevance AI. Can you talk us through some of those a little bit more, and help us to understand the different types of models that you're using, whether you're creating them yourself or whether they're sort of things off the shelf?
Yeah, so we have created all of the models ourselves, just to that point. So we've built our own AIs. we have increasingly started to use large language models within our models. So as ways to, because what we realized is that, you know, the behavioral aspects that we were picking out, we were significantly more advanced than the LLMs were about trying to be able to do that, partially based on the data, partially based on our training. We had built variable autoencoders and a range of different techniques and types of models to define and to predict these things. And then we started to understand that actually, if we could incorporate some of the language models into those processes, whether within a variable autoencoder, for example, we are then temporarily producing synthetic data as part of our privacy mechanisms, et cetera, and we would start to use them for very specific things in the process. So because LLMs are very good at some things, but not good at others, it's a question of actually really learning how to combine the best of what we've built with what's been coming. So now we're into a world, and I'll come to the relevance bit in a second, relevance AI, but we're in a world where the interfaces that we engage with are changing dramatically. So historically, we have a whole lot of, you know, very nice interfaces that you know, our users absolutely love. But, you know, part of our current recognition is the world is changing. People don't want dashboards anymore. You know, people want you know, and expect you to come with a set of things that says, okay, what's changed in my base this week, and you know, what are the top 5 things I need to do? And so, you know, from there, you're actually in a place where you're being prescriptive about the kinds of things that they should be doing in order to optimize whatever their goals are. And so, you know, have them set their goals, but then that needs a different kind of experience. That experience is actually partly language, and that's where the LLMs play a great part, because they can help you really refine that. But part of that is the interface. I want to come back to and just weave in the relevance part, because actually, as we started to talk through the different AIs that we have, and the relevance part, and this was getting back to something I said earlier, which was when you're thinking about actually someone trying to define campaigns, what most companies do, because they're under pressure, and particularly the ones that are public, is that as they get closer to the end of the quarter, they send out more and more messages, because they're so desperate to reach their targets that actually, and so you see this mass spam wave. And we know that from some of our customers that they've hit the red zone, where the response rates they get have just declined and declined and declined over time, to the point where, you know, many customers just want to switch off. Yeah, that next message, I'm switching off my notifications. I don't want any more from you. And what we've realized is that we can, you know, we've developed a suite of causal-based AI. We're one of the few companies that have really gone into that space very deeply. That's another one of our types of approaches. And understanding the causation behind the behaviors that are happening, like switching off those notifications, allows us, for any campaign or audience that we might create for a customer, to say, like, who's going to switch their notifications off if we sit to this, or who will never respond because they never respond, or who do we not need to send a message to because they're going to upgrade anyway or do whatever it is that you're looking to achieve. And that means you can just focus on the people that matter. And, you know, then you might be sending a tenth of the messages. One stat actually in, you know, two, we have done a lot of work. We took the number of messages per year down from 460 per year to 65 per customer. Right. So you see that whilst driving and increasing revenue. So you see this massive reduction into the noise that's coming out of that equation. And that's all about relevance. But relevance applies to pricing too. So if you think about pricing, and so we have a pricing AI that's actually looking at what's the optimal price for you within a band, right? Because usually what's happening, particularly in the telco space, but also some of the banking spaces, is companies find it too difficult to price, you know, the way an airline would price in terms of variability. Yeah. So which is based on yield. And so you need something in between that is more structured, because there's an expectation set around products like telcos and your upgrade pricing. So the question is, how much do I discount for you as an individual? And we can optimize that, right? So as you start to look at the entire personalization or hyper personalization journey, you realize that every component of that can be priced, or can be impacted. And part of this leads me to sort of partially to one of the last things I'd like to talk about, which is our activation AI, which is thinking about the entire journey. So going all the way from the data that's on the devices through to how do you activate them at the end of the day. And so we've developed models that actually, when you lift your device, we see the accelerometer on the device moving, and we can know that you've actually picked up your phone, and we know exactly what time of day the right time to contact you is. Because much of the time you get a message and it's just the wrong time, you're driving or whatever it might be, and forget, you're never going to respond to that message. But actually knowing when you will respond, being able to actually share the message at that time, leads to massively increased engagement. And part of this whole process for us was understanding that the journey is a horizontal one. And what most people don't realize is that AI generically is about horizontal journeys, not vertical journeys. So, as software businesses in the past, we have thought about ourselves as businesses that need to go deep to win. So you take a small space, you get very deep in it, and that's how you're successful. Right. But actually, AI is something fundamentally different, because the challenge most companies have is their own processes and their own structures and the way they do things today. And so you might be able to produce the world's best AI, but you're going to get no ROI out of it if the company has processes, the company that you're working with has processes that just don't work like that. And so then you're into a different issue, which is, how do I stitch the whole chain together to make sure that I can go from, handling super sensitive data all in the right way through the other side to actually the moment you're actually engaging with it on the phone.
So that's kind of interesting, because that's also the topic of adoption, which is a massive hurdle for AI businesses who are trying to sell into enterprises, but also with the people responsible for AI transformation within those larger organizations, getting not just customer adoption, but also getting the employees to adopt and use some of those incredible tools that have been built is hard. And there's, we get into another time talking about, what are the reasons why individuals at a behavioral level don't want to start using those. But what you were saying was really interesting about that horizontal approach. So I think that's actually right, in that at the moment, there's a lot of, within organizations, there's a lot of silos. So people might be using some AI tool, like a SaaS model over here in marketing. Marketing's quite an early adopter, and you'll probably have some SaaS tools over here in the tech stack that maybe the CTO and the IT department are using, maybe some in HR. But I think, to your point, the challenge is, how do you sort of bring those all together into that horizontal layer? And I wanted to sort of ask whether that also leads into agentic, because I know you've been quite an advocate for using agentic. So I wanted to find out whether agentic is part of the solution that you see when you start to think about that more horizontal model.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a key part. Just give you one example first, that kind of, because it was very instructive to us, and it's how we have some clients where we deliver massive, millions of dollars a week in incremental value, whereas most AI businesses are stuck in POC hell. They're just trying to get through that journey. And the example was, as customer, they would get to a point where you had made a prediction, but the values that were being impacted were very big. So the finance team wanted to get involved, and then the finance team wanted to model it on spreadsheets individually, which took a matter of weeks. So kind of by that time, you've actually lost much of the opportunity. And so you have a prediction, you go somewhere else, it's stuck 6 weeks whilst the finance team approve it or don't approve it, and then kind of large part of that value has gone. And so our question was, well, how do you fix that, or how do you join up that chain? we realized that what we needed to do was predict the return that they were going to get from that particular audience. So you could automatically say, hey, if we're in this banding of our predicted return, then actually just go ahead, right? No finance approval needed. And so then you're into, okay, you have to develop a new little bit of AI to cover that bit of the value chain, and then you can move on to the next. And it's a little bit like that. And actually that leads right into the agentic stuff, because this is actually a place where the LLMs start to have, in our view, a huge value, because as most people have thought about the AI space, they've really focused on the models. Like the key question has been, how good are the models? Are they hallucinating? Are they not? How do you manage that? But the bigger issue is actually how do you translate those words into actual action? Because really what we find is that people want the easy button.
Yeah.
And you give them lots and lots of complexity and screens and actually get it all, but no one really has time anymore to do that. We're so trained into how do we get things done right now? But then something else you start to realize is that as you get more into the agent space and agentic, you realize that when you can put these fleets of agents together, then something really new happens, which is you can actually improve the results, because as humans we don't think about the breadth of everything that needs to happen. And so we have an example where in one agentic flow that we have and are building out, you have an agent that understands the brand, right? So I'm whatever it could be. I could be an Indian takeaway in Dubai. And let's just take a real world thing. And then what's the marketplace for that? So you have an agent that understands the brand and what's their positioning in the market, the high and low end, automatically. Then another that understands what's the market for that, who's actually buying, who's not. Another agent that understands behavior, another agent that understands how to optimize the results from the campaigns. And you realize that there's, in each of those, there's lots of complexity. And no human would ever go through the process. Is too involved, is too detailed. And the LLMs, though, can feed you with key parts of that information that we can actually then refer to our own tools or models, if you like, to understand the behaviors and the different AIs that we have to feed those in. The result is you just get significantly better results. What you're translating is you're taking, I think about what we're doing is creating autonomous intent. So when we think about understanding intentions, like what's someone's real intent right now, how do you make that an automated process? Because I get Google keywords right now in Google, and I have to go and then do something like create my own campaigns, build stuff off the back of it. But in that agent world, actually then you can automate that entire process. And so that's radically different.
I'd love to know how that's actually sort of being bolted together, because a couple of episodes ago we had another member who was talking about an agentic solution that they're building within the production development, the software development flow. And they were saying that the good thing there is there's already a nice process and system in place, so they can actually sort of bolt in the different agents and the MCP to kind of link everything up within that existing flow. It sounds like what you're explaining also sounds like a process to a flow which already exists. But I'm really interested to understand the level of maturity or the level of sort of finessing that exists at the moment. Would you say that we're still at the beginning of having to bolt all these things together, or is it a little bit more advanced now? Are those kind of processes sort of already starting to take shape?
That's a great question. I think one of the ways that the team who are building this started to think about it was something that's called the circle of Willis. And the circle of Willis is actually how blood flow around the base of your skull. And like all the different veins, they form, but they actually form a circle where all the nutrients actually go around and can be circulated in the right way to feed your brain. So part of the idea was like, how do we get this flow, this circular system, where these agents can all talk to each other? And then what you realize is that as you think about that flow, is that the key componentry in it is understanding memory. So how do you maintain memory across these different agents so that they all know each other, know about what they're doing and talk to each other and respond in ways. And to do that, rather than going into the specifics of it, we've thought about that as a messaging system, right? So the agents need to message other agents and maintain their memory, and so actually that the process of stitching and putting that together actually works really well now, because there are things like MCP servers and A2A. You start to be able to connect into other agent systems and connect much more easily out into databases and other things like that, that mean that if you do it in the right way, your chance for hallucination is super low. So because you can validate, you can choose not to act in certain circumstances, you can validate. So those things actually dramatically change an organization's ability to adopt, because one of the key problems that most companies have in the moving from POC to adoption is, can I trust it? And so when you're thinking about can you trust it, you need to do two things. You need to be able to show the user why they can trust it. So actually show that transparency in a visual, or go down and see the kinds of things that have been brought back or logged so you can validate it. And you need to do that in a nice way, not in a log form, of course. And you also need to be able to access all of the underlying systems to make sure that that data comes back in the right way. But when you do that, you can actually solve that problem. So it's still early. I think most of us who are working in the space are still in the early stages of this process. But I think it's the key components to make it work now really well are there. They're all in place, and some of the final things that I think were a challenge, I think we've got to understand how to solve them.
Yeah, no, that's really insightful. Thank you for giving us that picture of the level of maturity, I think, within the industry. I'd also like to come back to transformation, because we touched on it a little bit earlier on, but you work with some of the largest organizations in the world, and you've seen some of the ways in which they have approached, agentic and AI. What are the sort of the barriers? What are the sort of the things which you've seen which are stopping that adoption, and how do you help them overcome it? And are there any other kind of tips and advice that you would give organizations going through that transformation?
Yeah, I think multiple levels actually. The first is one about the level of risk we're willing to take. So in the West, we have set our threshold level for risk way too low. If you go to the emerging markets, it's different. They don't have that risk threshold set at that level. But what's happened over time is our risk threshold has come further and further and further down. So we're not, as most organizations, particularly large ones, willing to accept almost any risk at all. It's like we've become super safe. And in that mindset, you lose the opportunity to win, because actually you do have to take risk. And the first stage to taking risk, in my view, is to reconceive the company as a data and compute company. So any business today is now shifting to be a data and compute company. And if you start from that understanding, because most of us don't think like that. We think we're a telecoms company or a bank, or our mental mind models are very, very different. So it's coming back to, well, if we're a data and a compute company, but we happen to provide a banking service, then how do we think about the world? And if you ask that question, that's the first building block. The second is to start things with your task is to 10x what you're doing, right? If that's the start question, it's not, I'm going to use AI to make some incremental benefit, to add a prediction here that will just take this thing. It's how do I 10x, right? And I think teams get very excited about that if you can give that challenge to a team, right? And so it's quite motivational as a way to do it. The third thing I would say is that most organizations are focused on use cases. And we get it so much so that we are sometimes forced into working with clients on use cases. Really, use cases aren't so useful. primarily because in the way that we talked about horizontal, you want to think about a value chain, not a use case. A use case might be part of a value chain, but to be successful, to really deliver results out the end, you have to go all the way across the journey. And that means identifying what is the value chain that I want to actually impact here, and how do I impact all the way from the underlying data to actually its use. Whereas usually the use case is some small component of that. But what you realize is that you can identify, a different set of value streams and then pick them off one by one. And maybe there's a sequence in which actually is better to do to start one versus another. This is heaven for consulting companies. There's such an opportunity for them to make gazillions in this space.
No, I agree with that. I think that's the opportunity for them to go in. But actually, what you've shared there, I think three really powerful ideas. They're very sort of novel in their approach. I love that concept of thinking of an organization as a data and compute company. You do hear a few of the sort of the American, Californian companies talking about themselves, like Tesla calls themselves like a computer company with cars. That type of that sort of mentality. But it's that same sort of approach that actually, if you turn it around and make all companies think about themselves as a data and compute company, it changes the focus and the prioritization of what they're trying to do. I think the other thing you shared as well, which I thought was really powerful, was that how do you get to 10x? Setting yourself that sort of moonshot goal of being able to achieve something really big. Again, that focuses the mind. It shifts the thinking from, well, maybe I won't be able to achieve that just working by myself here in my own little silo. I have to think about linking things up. I have to think bigger picture, and it kind of breaks down those silos. That's great. And then I think your other point, which I wrote down, was about this sort of going from use case to a more holistic approach. So building on the two previous points as well, but you can't just be thinking about doing this in isolation. You've got to be thinking about how it impacts the overall organization. So I think there's a lot of value which you've added there in terms of sharing how to approach transformation. We're going to have to kind of start to wrap things up, Jonathan, but just before we can start to do that, I wanted to ask you one last question, which I think is around the sort of the global perspective, because I know you've got a background, sort of international background. I think you grew up in Kenya, and I wanted to get your sort of perspective on what does it look like as we start to sort of build out this sort of global AI industry, and what impact is it having on the future of work? Because whilst it's great for us in the organizations that you talked about transforming, it's going to have an impact on workers all over the world, but particularly in the global south. And is that something that you've been sort of looking at and have thought about?
Yeah, it's interesting. I did a 8-week trip earlier this year around the world without going home, so I got to see literally every continent, and focused on this AI question and what we're doing. And I think my learning from that is probably because of that risk factor, the increased risk tolerance in these growing economies. I think they will get there faster than the West. And so I think they will adopt AI quicker than the West will, and they will probably become better at it. And that will lead to massively increased education capabilities, for example, in Africa, that will then actually translate into a further shift in work into those environments. I do think that we will go through a pretty massive set of disruption in the process, but I think ultimately when you get through that disruption, we'll have a very positive future. But that it changes the nature of jobs. If I'm currently a call center operative in Kenya, because they moved from the call centers moved from India to Kenya or wherever, because the price value, maybe what I do changes. So instead of being on the end of a call, maybe now I'm validating whether this AI prediction is true or false as a human. And so the nature of what they do will change in that, particularly as actually this is adopted. So I think there are two points to that. I think the growing world will actually overtake the Western world in this space, perhaps with the exception of China. And It's partially because the West is very slow right now at AI adoption. They all have initiatives, but they're all in this very slow mode, this very risk growth, other than a few companies that are really going for it. So it's quite complex. I think it's quite a complex answer. But I think that there, some of the things politically, like universal incomes and other approaches, which, to be honest, the trials that existed for that haven't worked. I don't know if there have been tests of that in the States and a number of other areas. It haven't worked, but we are going to need some ways to mitigate the level of disruption over the next 5 years, I think, or maybe in the 4 to 8 year period rather than the more immediate.
Yeah, no, I think that's really useful insight there. And you're definitely right that there is an acceleration in a lot of those developing markets, emerging markets, where they see the opportunity and they've got a very young workforce who are highly trained, thinking particularly places like India, where they're actually sort of racing ahead on some of these things. And at the moment they might be behind, but the inertia, the momentum they're building is so fast that they're going to overtake us pretty soon. And I think particularly if you add in things like open source there as well, the opportunity for them to sort of start using some of the open source materials will then put them in a very strong position. But also, John,
also, just you see some of those companies are being very smart about it. When we think about Africa here in the West, we don't think about, we think about the continent in a particular way. But one of what I found is cities the world over are the same. They have the same problems. They're thinking about the same, their customer bases and so forth. And what I'm seeing some of them do is actually hire some of the best people out of the West. People who are working at Spotify and other places, and now they're leads. And so suddenly you've got this shift that's happening where, because they all have money actually. So in those growing economies, the bigger companies all have money. They're not short of it. And so what they're doing is they're actually saying, okay, now let's really lead here. And they have the risk level and the willingness. And so there's this real go for it space.
Yeah, no, I think that's also a very good point. And you do see that with the levels of investment. I mean, obviously the Gulf states are unique in the level of investment that they can put into this. Exactly. And they're doing that. But I think you're right, in other countries as well, that they are investing heavily. I think in places like South Korea, where they've just devised this nationwide program of education, which they're investing in because they see that'll return massively over the years as they start to have all those young people come up. And I think risk is something that we come back to. Maybe we explore that in another episode, because I think that in itself is like a part of the cultural profile of the West, which you're right, means that we aren't able to take as many risks, accelerate, try things. It is sort of holding us back a little bit. But then we also have to balance that against the need for some safety and security and legislation. And those two, again, this is why I think that could be a whole nother episode that we could do.
Yeah, I actually think legislation is incredibly important in the next years, in multiple ways, the levels of it, but it will become increasingly important.
Yeah. Well, let's come back and have another session on that, I think, or maybe we get you along to one of the events where we're actually talking about that in Parliament as well. But Jonathan, just to kind of wrap up, can you sort of tell us how we can stay in touch with IntentHQ and find out more about your work, and then we'll have to wrap things up.
So you can reach me at jonathan.lakin@intenthq.com. The website is intenthq.com. That's with an HQ, and we'd love to be in contact with you.
That's brilliant. Well, Jonathan, we've covered many topics there. It's been fascinating to hear the work you're doing, how it came from those initial insights into the behavior of consumers, and how you've started to build these systems and processes to serve enterprise clients right across the world, and all of those insights then you've been able to give us on transformation, but also the global perspective. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for the great questions and being such a gracious host. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.